Last week we discussed how the makeup of an ecological community changes over time, and the name we gave that process was ecological succession. Essentially, different populations in a community altered the ecosystem in some way that made it possible for other populations to come in and outcompete the existing populations, thus changing the makeup of the community. This week, we'll step back and look at the population level instead of the community level. And we're going to start with Chapter 10 material on evolution and extinction. So first, populations, and how do populations change over time? How is it that a population can have so much genetic variation? How can traits in a population change over time, whether it's coloration or size of appendages, etc.? And how can a new species form? These are all good questions, and the answer to all of them can be found in an understanding of evolution and natural selection. First, let's look at evolution. We'll use your textbook definition. Evolution: differences in gene frequencies within a population from one generation to the next. Thus, basically, evolution is how a population changes genetically over time. In this respect, there's really nothing controversial about evolution. We know populations change genetically over time. We can study this directly in simple populations that reproduce quickly, like bacteria, by actually sequencing their DNA. Further, humans have intentionally worked to change particular populations of plants and animals over time by breeding them to maximize desired traits. Next, let's look at the mechanism by which evolution works: natural selection. Your book definition is shown. The process by which organisms best adapted to the environment, the fittest, survive to reproduce, leaving more offspring than the less well-adapted individuals. We commonly hear people call this the survival of the fittest. This is true, but we must remember that the fittest does not necessarily mean biggest or strongest. It simply means those individuals that are best adapted to their environment. In some cases, that might mean being the strongest or the fastest or the biggest, but in other cases, it might mean being the smallest, or having just the right coloration, or having some strange feature that deters predators. The term natural selection was introduced in 1859 by Charles Darwin in his influential book On the Origin of Species. Darwin came up with his ideas based on observations of the natural world. In particular, Darwin observed the following. First, species tend to overproduce. Populations produce more young than will survive. Second, variation. The offspring vary genetically. They are not all the same. Third, there's limits on population growth. There's environmental stresses like predation or limited resources that limit the size of the population. And next, differential reproductive success. That is, those that are the best adapted to the environmental stresses are most likely to survive and reproduce, thus passing along their favorable genetic traits to the next generation. The best adapted, or fittest, for a particular environment may be the fastest, best able to escape from predators, or those of a certain color pattern, best able to hide from a predator, or those with the strongest beak, best able to crack open a new nut food source, or those with a particular chemical, yuck, tastes bad to the predator, or even those that are the smallest, best able to hide in little cracks in the rock or in the coral. The key idea is that genetic traits that make a particular organism best adapted depend on the particular environment in which the organism lives. There are different selective pressures in different environments. Thus, in this way, an entire population can change genetically to become better adapted to their environment. If a population changes enough, it may even become a new species. Importantly, in order for a population to evolve, there needs to be significant genetic diversity within the population. If a population has low genetic variability, it runs the risk of not being able to adapt to the environmental stress. In this case, the population may not be able to evolve, and thus it will not survive. Review infographic 11.1 in your text, shown here, to see an example of how natural selection can work under the selective pressure of predation. Pause the video and check it out. Your book notes that humans have been selecting for desirable traits in plants and animals for centuries. Rather than relying on only natural selective pressures, humans have decided which traits they wanted to see in particular animals and plants. And then they've selected the organisms that would survive and reproduce, and thus the population has evolved in the desired manner. We call this artificial selection, in contrast to natural selection. Instead of a population evolving to be best adapted to its environment, the population evolves to be best suited to whatever human need or whim is selected. Clearly, populations do evolve, i.e., change genetically, over time, and natural selection and artificial selection can both drive these changes. Before we move on, I encourage you to pause the video and answer the following questions. So pause the video now. Now that we understand evolution by natural selection, let's take a look at the fascinating topic of coevolution. From your textbook, the definition of coevolution is two species that each provide the selective pressure that determines which traits are favored by natural selection in the other. Pause the video briefly and read over that definition again and see that it makes sense. Coevolution is especially apparent in predator-prey relationships. Some textbooks talk about predator-prey relationship as a coevolution arms race. Each population is adapting to be better able to catch the other or better able to avoid or escape from the other. In all cases, the adaptations are based on selective pressures of the other population. Let's take a look first at predator strategies. What adaptations make a predator better suited to pursuing or ambushing prey? I've put a couple predator photos here, the tuna and a gecko, to spark your ideas. What adaptations does each of these organisms have that make it more effective at either pursuing or ambushing prey? What predator adaptations did you come up with? You should have several ideas. List them. Look at the photos. What makes the tuna such a great predator? What makes the gecko such a great predator? Also consider other predators: eagles, owls, lions, wolves, anteaters, etc. List some traits. Now let's consider the prey. What adaptations make a prey organism better suited to avoid getting eaten? Can you think of different strategies that various prey species employ in order to avoid predation? And once you've thought of the strategies, what specific traits have to evolve in order for them to employ these strategies? Here's some ideas of strategies for avoiding predation. For each of the above defense examples, can you think of a particular species that employs these strategies? And then think of the traits that have evolved through natural selection in order for them to be able to employ that strategy. Now let's look at plant defenses. Importantly, plants don't have feet or wings or fins, so for the most part, plants can't flee. Pause the video for a moment and see if you can come up with some different strategies plants use to protect themselves against predation. And then consider what sort of adaptations the plant would need in order to employ that strategy. For each of the above defense examples, can you think of a particular species that employs these strategies? In coevolution, the predator exerts selective pressures on the prey, and the prey evolves. Only the best adapted prey will survive, and they will pass these traits along to their offspring. Similarly, the prey, as it becomes more difficult to catch, exerts selective pressures on the predator, and the best adapted predator will prevail and pass along the traits to its offspring. Thus, as this continues on and on, the predator-prey relationship becomes a bit of an arms race. Notably, the predator and prey populations don't consciously try to change. For example, a prey species doesn't try to develop toxins. Rather, a random mutation that produces a toxin makes one organism better able to resist predation. Thus, that organism survives and passes along the trait to its offspring. Similarly, the predator doesn't consciously try to develop a resistance to a toxin. However, those who are not affected by the toxin, due to random mutation, would be better able to survive and pass along the desirable trait to their offspring. Lastly, you can see the importance of genetic variability within a population. In order for a population to be able to adapt to the selective pressures it faces, there needs to be variation in the gene pool. The greater the variation, the more likely the population will be able to adapt to various selective pressures. But what happens if a population is not able to adapt to a changing environmental condition or a new invasive predator? Simply, the answer is they do not survive. The population will go extinct. If genetic variation within a population is low, or if change happens quickly, it will be more difficult for the population to evolve. This is especially true for organisms that have long generation times. For example, insects and bacteria reproduce quickly and can have more opportunities for genetic variation, but large mammals may take decades to reproduce. In some situations, they may be all wiped out before there's much chance for reproduction at all. Review K-selected and R-selected species from Chapter 9. Notably, extinction is nothing new. There has always been a low background rate of extinction, as some species are not able to adapt to changing environmental conditions. However, we also know of 5 periods over geologic time where massive extinctions have taken place, in general due to climatic changes that were caused by geologic conditions such as volcanoes or meteor impacts. Today, most ecologists agree that we're in another stage of mass extinction, also due to climatic change. But this time, the climate change is not due to geologic conditions, but human actions. Chapter 11 in your textbook does a good job of discussing extinction, but I'd like to add another important point to that discussion. Some populations are more vulnerable to extinction than others. Consider how the following factors would affect a population's vulnerability to endangerment or extinction. How would each of these characteristics make a population more vulnerable to endangerment or extinction? Can you come up with a specific organism that might fall into one of these categories? Lastly, I'll state the obvious. Extinction diminishes biodiversity. We're going to cover biodiversity in the next video clip, and we'll see why declining biodiversity has the potential to cause harmful impacts to human populations.